Or if you make the obvious comparison between the current situation, the occupied territories, and another conflict, the obvious comparison, as Jimmy Carter did in the title of his book, was to compare what Israel is doing in the occupied territories with apartheid under the South African regime. Now, when Mr. Carter made that comparison, you might recall it evoked all of this hysteria, this hue and cry. How can you compare the two? And what was kind of funny for anybody who knows the conflict is that comparison is always being made in Israel. It's not an unusual comparison at all. B'Tselem, in the Israeli Human Rights Organization, 2002, it writes, I'll read it quickly, Israel has created in the occupied territories a regime of separation based on discrimination, applying two separate systems of law in the same area, basing the rights of individuals on their nationality. This regime, it says, is reminiscent, is the only one of its kind in the world, the only one, and is reminiscent of distasteful regimes from the past, such as the apartheid regime in South Africa. A more recent report, B'Tselem wrote a report on the Jews-only roads that Israel has built in the occupied territories. And then it says, this system of roads bears striking similarities to the racist apartheid regime and is even more arbitrary than the South African regime. Haaretz, Israel's main newspaper, September 2006, the apartheid regime in the territories remains intact. Haaretz, October 2007, the de facto separation is today more similar to political apartheid than an occupation regime. Israel's former Attorney General, Michael Ben Yair, from 1996. He says, we enthusiastically chose to become a colonial society, ignoring international treaties, and on and on. And in the end, he says, this is the former Attorney General, in effect, we established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories. Israel's former Minister of Education, Shulamit Aloni. The U.S. Jewish establishment's onslaught on former President Jimmy Carter is based on him daring to tell the truth, which is known to all. Through its army, the government of Israel practices a brutal form of apartheid in the territory it occupies. You're told not to compare again, so as to force you to scrupulously avoid the obvious analogies. Is the conflict so complicated? Are the roots of the conflict so complicated? You open up Jeffrey Goldberg's book, Prisoners, and he says to understand this conflict, you have to understand the Muslim mind, because these Muslims, they envy the Jews. That's the problem. For those of you who've read your Nietzsche 101, the whole problem is ressentiment, envy. So he says it was terribly hard for Muslims to accept that their inferiors, the Jews, now ruled Palestine. This made no sense in the worldview of many Muslims who were at least sure that they were better than the Jews. That's the problem. Then there's this other grande tête. That's French, spoken by a person from Brooklyn. This fellow named Paul Berman. Who knows Paul Berman? Lucky, only one. Milwaukee is insulated from civilization. You're very lucky. No, it's your good fortune. So he writes a book called Terrorism and Liberalism. It was very popular on the eve of the war against Iraq. And he has to explain these suicide bombers. Where do they come from, these weird people? And he says, it's all there in Albert Camus. All you have to do is read Camus, and you'll understand the suicide bombers. For those of you who haven't read it, it's this book called The Rebel, and Berman explains it this way. First, there was modernism. Then there was the will to rebel. And then there was the will to die. And that's where suicide bombers come from. So if you ever want to know why Palestinians blow themselves up, just read Camus. Okay, that's what the sophisticated New Yorkers have to say. Then you take a fellow like Benny Morris. Benny Morris, he's a good historian. He's very crude, like many Israelis. He writes a good book. It's called Righteous Victims. How many people have read Righteous Victims? Raise your hand. That's pretty popular. It's a standard college textbook. And he, too, has to explain where does this Arab-Muslim enmity towards Zionism and Israel come from. But he doesn't resort to exotic theories from Nietzsche or Camus. He says, very simple, he says the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Now, many of you would think, well, what's so profound about that? But actually, it's a very interesting statement. Allow me to just repeat it. The fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say Arab antagonism to Zionism springs from anti-Semitism. He doesn't say it springs from hatred of Jews, fear of modernity, dread of the emancipation of women. No, it's very simple. Why did Arabs oppose Zionism? Because they were afraid of losing their homes, dispossession, and losing their country, displacement. It's as uncomplicated as that. And then he goes on to say, it's worth listening to. He says, in fact, their fear was perfectly rational. Let me quote him. Transfer, that means expulsion, was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. And this aim automatically produced resistance among the Arabs, that their fear of territorial displacement and dispossession, the fear of losing their home, was not an imaginary fear, it was a rational one. It was, to quote him, inbuilt into Zionism. It was inevitable. There's no need for exotic explanations. In fact, what's so peculiar about this conflict is that were these exotic explanations invoked in any other conflict, people would laugh. Take North America. The Native Americans resisting Euro-American encroachment, it was not a bed of roses. They killed men, they killed women, they killed children. It was very bloody. It was not for no reason that they were called savages, not that the Euro-Americans weren't also savage, but they were yesterday's terrorists. If you read the literature at the time, they weren't called Native Americans. They were just called, in the scholarly literature, they were called savages. But imagine if some historian or writer for the New Yorker of that day were to come along and say that the chief motor of Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment, the chief motor was anti-whiteism or anti-Europeanism or anti-Christianism. Well, of course, you would laugh. You don't need exotic explanations. The chief motor of Native American resistance was the fear of territorial displacement and dispossession, just like in the case of the Palestinians in the past and the case today. The second kind of false, contrived controversy is this dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust, the playing of the Holocaust card. Time doesn't allow me to go into that. Let's just say that the main contribution of what came to be, in effect, a Holocaust industry was this claim that the Nazi Holocaust was so unique and Jewish suffering was so unique that you can't compare it to any other human suffering, and accordingly, Jews should not be held to the same moral standards as anyone else because of the unique suffering that they endured. There's a huge literature, can fill quite a number of rooms in the library, trying to prove this Holocaust uniqueness doctrine. As an intellectual doctrine, it's completely empty, and as a moral doctrine, it's a complete abomination. This notion of ranking human suffering as if there's some way to measure that a child being napalmed is suffering less than a child being thrown into a gas chamber. How do you prove it? And why would you even want to go there morally? But if it was intellectually empty and morally an abomination, it served a very useful political purpose. Namely, it was used to justify and continues to be used to justify Israel's human rights violations on the grounds that Jews suffered uniquely. So, if Israel was the only country in the world, and it was, to legalize torture, we're told, remember the Holocaust. If Israel was the only country in the world to use house demolitions as a legal form of punishment, we're told, remember the Holocaust. If Israel was the only country in the world to legalize hostage-taking, again we're told, remember the Holocaust. And just the other day, I came across another uniqueness of Israel, not just the torture, the house demolitions, and the hostage-taking, but it turns out that in July, August 2006, when Israel dropped 4.6 million cluster submunitions on South Lebanon. It was the densest bombardment of cluster munitions in the history of the world, relative to the size of the geographic space. There's just been nothing like it in the history of the world, including by the United States against Iraq in 1991 and then subsequently. The other novel use of the Nazi Holocaust is this claim that the Arabs were either responsible for the Nazi Holocaust, and yes, that's said, or that they are the natural